Hello, my name is Alex Morris, and I am a senior at Stillman College, and my thesis is on how are the treatment-seeking behaviors of African Americans raised in the Southern Baptist Christian environment affected by Christianity. The effects of Christianity on the treatment-seeking behaviors of African Americans raised in the Southern Baptist Christian environment will be researched and discussed. 30 men and 30 women who live in the southern region of the United States and practice Baptist Christianity will be surveyed and interviewed in an attempt to discover the underlying reason behind the lack of professional treatment seeking for mental health issues among African Americans. Amplifications of the reasons of the results of future research will be discussed. The reason I chose to research this, while I was living and kind of dealing with some issues in my life, um, a lot of things, school work and personal stuff, kind of began to pile up and things like that, and I got kind of in a low depressed state, and to the point where I needed to talk to someone, but before I got to that, where I was actually talking to a trained professional, a lot of the advice that I got from family and friends close to me, all of which were African American and Christian, and of course in the South, a lot of the advice they gave me, it was pretty repetitive. The reason that I was feeling depressed or I was, having all these problems is because, I don't pray enough. I don't go to church enough. I'm not as devoted to Christianity as I should be. If I were, God wouldn't have me feeling depressed, or, if I was, really, really Christian, I wouldn't feel depressed. And it started me to thinking on, the fact that African Americans really don't seek out mental health treatment outside of the church, and they don't see it as a real issue. They don't see it as a real problem, or, something that needs to be dealt with, when it actually is. We're not immune to mental illness of any kind simply because we're African American, and the stigma that we don't need mental health services, and that all we need is to devote ourselves more to the church and to the Bible, is a real problem. In my literature review, I did think some of the things I found were a lack of research in mental health in the Black community in comparison to other groups, dearth of information on how to include the church within mental health treatment of various hypotheses to follow, and Black Americans are overwhelmingly Christian. I'm pretty sure that's a very common fact, but likewise with the lack of mental health seeking treatment from African Americans. But another big issue that I found was, one of the first things I mentioned, the lack of research into African Americans and mental health. Some of the other things I found was that the majority of African Americans are involved with churches, historically main cornerstone of African American life. It's an acceptable way for many African Americans to gather, and African Americans receive most of their information about local, social, and political issues from the church. That can present many problems. Some of the other things that I found was that a plethora of racial stigmas have caused such a slow start on mental health studies for African Americans. The National Alliance of Mental Health states only about 25% of African Americans seek mental health care services at all, compared to 40% of whites. It's a big difference. Um, Reverberations from slavery could also be a major cause for reluctance in addition to side effects of medication use and treatment. And research towards the present dialogue on mental health presented by the church needs to be studied. Basically, throughout my research, one of the things I came across is that uh, in many ways, and I know our society doesn't like to talk about it, but African Americans are still being affected by the transatlantic slave trade. Some of my operational terms would be Christian, Baptist Christian, mental health, Southern, mental illness, antidepressant medication, and federal poverty level. Those will be words that will be found quite often throughout the entirety of my thesis, and I felt the need to operationally define them for the purpose of my thesis. Um, African Americans of the southern regions of the United States who practice Baptist Christianity from several metropolitan churches in Tuscaloosa and Montgomery, Alabama, are where I'm seeking to get participants. I would like to receive at least 30 men and 30 women, age range between 15 and 60. And the study will be comprised of surveys, interviews, and an experiment. And the experiment will be an observational study with a sample case. And the reason that I chose these two cities was obviously I reside in Tuscaloosa currently, and I'm from Montgomery, Alabama, so I'm familiar with many of the churches there. So going to churches in Montgomery, Alabama, and I am familiar with a few in Tuscaloosa, so that would just make it easier to carry out my research. And the reason I chose, I know people would think 15 is such a young age, but that is a very prevalent age for mental illness. And I know people don't really, when people think of mental illness such as depression and things like that, they don't think of 60 as being such an older age, but mental illness has no cutoff age. And so I wanted to get representation from as many areas as possible. And that's why I chose that area and that aspect of it. And the reason that I wanted to do a survey and interviews and things were because I want to be able to get as many different results as possible. And with such a touchy area, I just want to make sure that I'm able to do it. Some of the sample questions that I have chosen, well, this is not a complete list, but just to name a few, what do you know about mental illness? What would you recommend to someone who told you they were suffering from depression? Do you think mental illness is a problem in the African American community? What do you consider to be a Christian? Do you think that African American Christian could ever have a need for clinical therapy? And those are just a few. Like I said, this list isn't complete yet, and these will be questions that will be incorporated into the surveys and into the experimental interviews that I plan to conduct in my study. As far as my results and discussion, my research obviously has not been completed at this time, but I hope to become more conscious in the reasoning behind occurrences surrounding my question. I also hope my findings will help find methods to improve mental health in the African American Baptist community. And by improve, I mean that I want to be able to get rid of get rid of that stigma that it's not something that affects African Americans, and if it does, the church is the answer. We just as much as any other race in society need help with mental health, and it's a big issue that we don't need to continue to sweep under the rug like we have been doing for quite some time. And I'm just really hoping that my research can help to push us towards an end to sweeping that under the rug. And I hope that the information that I receive and occurrence that happens throughout my research are unbiased and untampered due to wanting a good portrayal of the church or discomfort due to my unfamiliarity. Um, Basically, I don't want anyone to, hide anything and thinking I'm gonna, use this information to kind of paint a bad picture of the church, and because that's not what I set out to do in any way.